The engines screamed like wounded animals as 37,000 feet of sky suddenly became Daniel Rivera's worst nightmare. Through the cockpit window of the plummeting Gulfstream, he watched the ground rush toward them with sickening speed. The unconscious pilot slumped over blood-soaked controls, while behind him, billionaire tech mogul Victoria Sterling gripped her seat, her face drained of color. "We're going to die," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the shrieking alarms. Daniel's hands moved without hesitation. 10 years of hiding his past evaporated in an instant as muscle memory took over. He yanked the pilot from his seat and slid behind the controls of the aircraft worth more than most people's homes. The instruments blurred before his eyes, altitude dropping, engines failing, hydraulics compromised. Everything his nightmares had been made of for a decade, but this time, he wouldn't let anyone else die on his watch. The crisp October morning had started like any other at Pine Valley Regional Airport. Daniel arrived at 6:30. Sharp, coffee in hand, tool bag slung over his shoulder, the small municipal airfield sat nestled between rolling hills, painted gold and crimson with autumn leaves. Most days, it was quiet enough to hear the wind through the hangar doors. He'd been working as head mechanic here for 8 years now. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life he'd built after everything fell apart. His hands, once steady enough to pilot experimental aircraft through impossible maneuvers, now serviced Cessnas and Pipers for weekend flyers and flight students. "Morning, Danny," called out Rita Chen, the airport manager, as she unlocked the main office. "Got that fancy corporate jet coming in around 10. Owner wants a full inspection before they head back to Seattle." Daniel nodded. Already walking toward Hangar 3, where he'd prepped his workspace the night before. Corporate jets meant good money, and the Pine Valley School District had just sent another notice about overdue lunch fees for his daughter Emma. At 12 years old, she was too proud to accept the free lunch program, but too young to understand why her father couldn't afford the $15 a day. The Gulfstream G 650 touched down at exactly 10:05, its polished white fuselage gleaming in the morning sun. Daniel watched from the hangar as it taxied to the private terminal, sleek and powerful as a hunting falcon. Through the windows, he caught a glimpse of the passenger. A woman with steel-gray hair and sharp features, talking rapidly into a phone. 20 minutes later, she appeared at his workstation. Victoria Sterling stood 5'8" in heels that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly rent. Her charcoal business suit was perfectly tailored, and she wore confidence like armor, but something in her eyes looked tired, almost brittle. "You're the mechanic?" she asked, her tone brisk but not unkind. "Daniel Rivera. I'll be doing your pre-flight inspection." She nodded curtly. "I need to be back in Seattle by 3. We have a board meeting at 4 that can't be postponed." She paused, studying his face. "You look familiar. Have we met?" Daniel's chest tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Don't think so. I'll have your aircraft ready in an hour." She walked away, phone already pressed to her ear again. "Marcus, I don't care what the Shanghai office is saying. The merger happens on our terms, or it doesn't happen at all." Daniel began his inspection, running through the checklist with methodical precision. Exterior panels, landing gear, engine intakes, everything looked perfect. Almost too perfect. The Gulfstream was maintained like a museum piece, not a working aircraft. But as he examined the port engine, something made him pause. A hairline crack in the fuel line coupling. Barely visible. The kind of thing that might be missed in a routine inspection. But Daniel had learned long ago that the smallest flaws could kill you 37,000 feet above the earth. He traced the line with his finger, feeling the slight give in the metal. Under pressure and altitude, that crack would split wide. Fuel would spray directly onto the hot engine cowling. In minutes, the entire aircraft would become a flying torch. His hands shook as he reached for his phone to call Rita. But before he could dial, he heard Victoria Sterling's voice behind him. "Problem?" Daniel turned. She stood closer than before. Her sharp business mask slipped slightly. Up close, he could see the fatigue in her eyes, the tension in her jaw. She looked like someone carrying the weight of the world. "Fuel line needs replacement," he said quietly. "It's not safe to fly." Her face hardened. "How long?" "We don't have the part here." "It would need to be ordered. Maybe flown in from Seattle. 2 days, minimum." "That's not acceptable." Victoria pulled out her phone again. "I can have my maintenance team in by. Seattle handle it when we arrive." "Ma'am, I can't clear this aircraft for flight. That coupling will fail at altitude." She looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression. "You sound like you know what you're talking about." "I do." "Commercial pilot?" Daniel hesitated. "Something like that." Victoria Sterling was used to getting her way. She'd built Sterling Dynamics from a startup in her garage into a $50 billion aerospace empire by never accepting no as a final answer. But standing in this small-town hangar, looking at the mechanic's weathered face, she found herself remembering why she'd gotten into aviation in the first place. Her phone buzzed. Marcus again. "Victoria, the Shanghai team is threatening to walk. If you're not here by 4, handle it," she snapped, ending the call. She looked back at Daniel. "Fix it." "I told you. We don't have." "Then find another way. You said you were a pilot. Can you fly this aircraft?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Daniel's throat went dry. "It's not that simple. I'm not asking for simple. I'm asking if you can fly my plane." For a moment, Daniel was transported back 10 years. Back to the test facility outside Mojave, where he'd pushed experimental aircraft to their limits. Back to the day when everything had gone wrong and people had died because he'd pushed too hard, trusted too much in his own abilities. "Yes," he said finally. "I can fly it?" Victoria nodded. "Then we leave in 30 minutes. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The takeoff from Pine Valley went smoothly. Daniel sat in the co-pilot seat while Captain James Morrison, Victoria's regular pilot, handled the controls. Morrison was professional, competent, the kind of corporate aviator who'd flown executives around the world for 20 years without incident. "Beautiful morning for flying," Morrison commented as they climbed through 15,000 feet. "Should be smooth all the way to Seattle." Victoria sat in the main cabin, laptop open, furiously typing emails. Through the small window between cockpit and cabin, Daniel could see her profile sharp, focused, completely absorbed in her work. She lived in a world where billion-dollar deals hung on her decisions, where thousands of jobs depended on her next move. It was a world Daniel had once been part of, before everything fell apart. At 28,000 feet, Captain Morrison's face went pale. "That's not right," he muttered, scanning the instrument panel. "What is it?" Daniel asked, though he already suspected. "Port, engine pressure's dropping fast." Morrison's voice remained calm, professional, but his knuckles were white on the yoke. "We're losing fuel." The crack Daniel had found. Under pressure and altitude, it had finally failed. Jet fuel was spraying into the pace engine compartment like a deadly fountain. And in minutes, maybe seconds, it would ignite. "Declare an emergency?" Daniel said quickly. "We need to descend now." "Already on it." Morrison keyed his radio. "Seattle Center, Gulfstream 8. 7 Delta Mike, declaring an emergency. We have engine failure and fuel leak, requesting immediate descent and vectors to nearest suitable airport. In the cabin, Victoria looked up from her laptop as the aircraft suddenly banked left and began descending rapidly. What's happening? Before either pilot could answer, the port engine exploded. The blast shook the aircraft like a giant fist. Shrapnel tore through the fuselage, and the cabin filled with smoke. Victoria was thrown against the bulkhead as the Gulfstream rolled inverted, then snap-rolled back upright. In the cockpit, Captain Morrison fought to maintain control as alarms screamed and warning lights painted the instrument panel red. "Engine fire! I can't hold it!" Daniel watched in horror, as Morrison suddenly clutched his chest, his face contorting in agony. The captain's hands fell away from the controls as he collapsed forward, unconscious. The aircraft nosed over into a steep dive, 37,000 feet. Daniel's hands moved without conscious thought, muscle memory overriding 10 years of buried trauma. He grabbed the yoke and pulled back hard, fighting to arrest the dive as the altimeter spun like a clock gone mad. "Come on!" he whispered through gritted teeth. "Come on. Stay with me." The Gulfstream shuddered and groaned, structural limits pushed to their breaking point. Through the windscreen, the earth filled their vision: forests, roads, a small town growing larger by the second. Behind him, Victoria Sterling gripped her seat, her face white with terror, but her eyes fixed on Daniel's hands as they worked the controls with the precision of a surgeon. "You know what you're doing," she said. Not a question, but a statement of faith. Daniel's answer came, through the radio, as he keyed the mic with one hand while flying with the other. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Gulfstream 87 Delta. Mike, total engine failure. Pilot incapacitated, attempting emergency landing." The ground rushed up to meet them. Daniel could see individual trees now. Houses. A highway cutting through the valley like a scar. The aircraft was coming down too fast, too steep. A conventional landing was impossible. But Daniel Rivera hadn't been a conventional pilot. He spotted it at the last second. A stretch of Highway 89 running straight for nearly 2 miles between hills. No traffic visible. Wide enough for the Gulfstream's wingspan if he was perfect. If he was perfect. "Hold on!" he called back to Victoria, then banked hard right toward the highway. The Gulfstream skimmed over treetops so close that branches scraped the belly. Daniel pulled back on the yoke with everything he had, bleeding off speed, feeling for that perfect moment when the aircraft would settle onto the asphalt instead of slamming into it. "Gear up," he muttered to himself, keeping the landing gear retracted for a belly landing. "Flaps full. Come on, baby. Just a little more." The highway rushed beneath them. Daniel held his breath as the Gulfstream touched down with a screech of metal on asphalt. Sparks flew in brilliant cascades as the aircraft slid down the center line, friction and aerodynamics fighting against momentum and gravity. 3/4 of a mile later, the Gulfstream came to rest in a farmer's field. Smoke rising from its belly. But no fire, no explosion, just the sound of cooling metal. And 2 people breathing hard in the sudden silence. Daniel's hands shook as he shut down the remaining systems. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. In the cabin, Victoria Sterling slowly unbuckled her seatbelt. Her face pale, but her eyes bright with something that might have been wonder. "That was impossible," she said quietly. Daniel turned, in his seat, to look at her. "Yeah, it was." She studied his face for a long moment. "Who are you, really?" Before Daniel could answer, the sound of sirens filled the air. Emergency vehicles were racing down the highway toward them, red and blue lights flashing against the afternoon sky. "Just a mechanic," Daniel said, but they both knew it was a lie. Victoria Sterling had built her empire by reading people, by seeing through facades and finding the truth underneath. Looking at Daniel Rivera in the aftermath of the impossible landing, she saw something that made her chest tighten with recognition. She saw a pilot whose hands moved like poetry across aircraft controls, a man whose voice stayed steady, under pressure that would break most people, someone who'd saved her life with skills that went far beyond changing oil in weekend aircraft. Most importantly, she saw someone who was hiding from something. As the first responders reached the aircraft and began their emergency procedures, Victoria made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She was going to find out exactly who Daniel Rivera really was, and why a man with his abilities was fixing small planes in a forgotten valley instead of flying for the airlines, the military, or any aerospace company in the world. The secret he was hiding had to be worth more than his silence. And Victoria Sterling had built her fortune by uncovering secrets and turning them into opportunities. What she didn't know yet was that Daniel Rivera's secret would force her to confront the darkest chapter of her own company's history. That the man who'd just saved her life was the same man she'd helped destroy 10 years ago. And that before this was over, one of them would have to choose between justice and survival. The Seattle Times headline screamed across Victoria Sterling's mahogany desk 3 days later. Miracle landing. Mechanic saves tech billionaire in impossible highway landing. But it was the smaller text underneath that made her hands tremble. Pilot remains unidentified as investigation continues. Victoria stared at the grainy photograph of Daniel Rivera walking away from the wreckage, his face turned from the cameras, his shoulders carrying the weight of someone who'd done this before. The federal investigators had cleared him after 6 hours of questioning, calling his flying textbook emergency procedures, and the kind of skill you don't learn in weekend flight school. But when they'd asked for his pilot's license, his logbooks, for his flight history, Daniel had simply said, "I told you, I'm just a mechanic who knows how to fly." Now, sitting in her 40th floor office overlooking Elliott Bay, Victoria couldn't shake the image of his hands on those controls, the way he'd moved through the cockpit like he belonged there, the calm in his voice, as he'd talked them down from certain death. She opened her laptop and typed his name into the Sterling Dynamics personnel database. The search came back empty. Then she tried the FAA registry, the military databases her security team had access to, even basic background check services. Daniel Rivera, age 38. Pine Valley, Oregon. Single father. Mechanic's license current. No pilot's license on file. No military service record. No college degree. No digital footprint beyond basic employment records going back exactly 8 years. It was as if he'd materialized from thin air the day he started working at Pine Valley Regional. "Marcus," she called to her assistant through the intercom, "get me everything you can on Daniel Rivera. And I mean everything. Tax records, employment history, school records, whatever it takes." "Yes, ma'am. Anything particular you're looking for?" Victoria stared out at the gray Seattle sky, remembering the impossible calm in Daniel's voice as he'd saved both their lives. "I'm looking for a ghost." 2,000 miles away, Daniel Rivera sat at his kitchen table, helping his daughter, Emma, with her algebra homework. The small apartment above Joe's garage wasn't much: 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that doubled as dining room, walls thin enough to hear the neighbors, but it was home. "Dad, you're not paying attention," Emma said, tapping her pencil against the table. At 12, she had her mother's dark eyes and stubborn streak, plus a mathematical mind that reminded Daniel painfully of himself at that age. "Sorry, sweetheart. Show me the problem again." Patterson says we need to solve for X, but I don't understand why X matters if we already know the other numbers. Daniel smiled, despite the weight pressing on his chest. Sometimes the most important thing is the one you can't see right away. X might look like just a letter, but it's actually the key to understanding everything else. Like a secret? Like a secret. Emma nodded seriously, then bent back over her homework. Daniel watched her work, his throat tight with love and terror. For 8 years, he'd kept his secret buried. For 8 years, he'd been nobody. Just another small-town mechanic raising his daughter alone after her mother died in childbirth. But secrets, he'd learned, had a way of surfacing when you least expected them. His phone buzzed. A text from Rita at the airport. Corporate types asking questions about you. Wanted copies of your personnel file. Told them to talk to you directly. Daniel's blood went cold. He'd known this was coming from the moment he'd taken those controls. The moment he'd chosen to save Victoria Sterling instead of maintaining his cover. Dad? Emma looked up from her homework. You okay? You look funny. Daniel forced a smile. Just tired, kiddo. Long day. But as he helped Emma finish her math problems, his mind was racing through calculations of his own. How long before they found the truth? How long before they discovered that Daniel Rivera, small-town mechanic, was actually Captain Daniel Ghost Rivera, former test pilot for Sterling Dynamics' experimental aircraft division? How long before they learned that 10 years ago, he'd been Sterling Dynamics' rising star until the day he'd pushed an experimental fighter too hard, and 3 people died in the resulting crash, including Emma's mother, Dr. Sarah Chen, the brilliant aerospace engineer who'd been carrying their unborn child when the prototype's engine exploded over the Nevada desert. Victoria's private investigator called at exactly 9 a.m. the next morning. Patricia Hawthorne had been digging into other people's secrets for 20 years, and her voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd struck gold. Found your ghost, Miss Sterling, though you're not going to like what I discovered. Victoria set down her coffee. I'm listening. Daniel Rivera's real name is Daniel Chen Rivera. He changed it legally 8 years ago when he moved to Oregon. Before that, he was Captain Daniel Rivera, test pilot for Sterling Dynamics, experimental division, flight call sign, Ghost. The coffee cup slipped from Victoria's fingers, shattering against the marble floor. That's impossible. I've got the records right here. Distinguished military service, Air Force Academy graduate, recruited by Sterling Dynamics in 2012. Flew your most advanced prototypes for 3 years. Then, in 2015, there was an incident. Victoria's mouth went dry. What kind of incident? Test flight of an experimental fighter called Project Valkyrie. Engine failure at 12,000 feet. The aircraft exploded on impact. 3 fatalities. The ground crew chief, Dr. Sarah Chen from your engineering department, and Patricia paused. Dr. Chen was 8 months pregnant at the time. She and Captain Rivera weren't married, but she was carrying his child. Victoria gripped the edge of her desk. The Valkyrie incident. She remembered it now. The black mark on Sterling Dynamics' safety record. The lawsuits. The congressional hearings. Her father had been CEO then, and she'd been running the European division, insulated from the day-to-day operations. What happened to Rivera after the crash? Officially, he resigned. Unofficially, he was scapegoated. The investigation blamed pilot error, said he pushed the aircraft beyond design limits. But I found something interesting in the sealed court records, which is, Rivera filed a wrongful termination suit claiming the engine had a known defect that Sterling Dynamics covered up. The suit was settled out of court with a confidentiality agreement. Rivera disappeared after that. No pilot's license, no aviation jobs, Nothing until he surfaced in Oregon as a mechanic. Victoria closed her eyes, pieces of a horrible puzzle clicking into place. Patricia, I need you to get me everything on that incident. Every document, every report, every email. Whatever it costs. Already on it. Should have preliminary files to you by this afternoon. After she hung up, Victoria sat in her office, staring at the Seattle skyline. The man who'd saved her life was someone she'd helped destroy. Someone whose pregnant girlfriend had died because of her company's negligence, and now he was living in poverty. Raising his daughter alone. Working as a mechanic instead of flying, because Sterling Dynamics had stolen his career and his future. The irony was suffocating. She owed him her life twice over, once for the landing and once for a debt of justice that was 10 years overdue. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. That afternoon, the files arrived. Victoria spent 3 hours reading through incident reports, witness statements, and sealed depositions. With each page, her anger grew like a slow-burning fuse. The Valkyrie's engine had been rushed into production, despite Daniel's repeated warnings about stress fractures in the turbine assembly. The engineering team, led by Dr. Sarah Chen, had backed Daniel's concerns with detailed metallurgical analysis showing the defects. But Sterling Dynamics had been under pressure to deliver the prototype to the Pentagon. The military contract was worth $12 billion, and delays would mean penalties, maybe cancellation, so they'd ignored the warnings. The engine had failed exactly as Daniel predicted, exactly as Sarah had calculated. The explosion had killed 3 people and nearly taken Daniel's life when debris from the blast shattered the observation tower, where families and engineers had been watching the test. Sarah Chen had been standing next to the window, one hand on her swollen belly, the other shading her eyes as she watched the man she loved push their creation to its limits. The blast had thrown her 20 feet across the concrete floor. She'd lived long enough for the paramedics to perform an emergency cesarean section. The baby Emma had survived with minor injuries. Sarah had not. The official investigation blamed Daniel for exceeding flight parameters. It ignored the metallurgical reports, buried the engineering concerns, and painted him as a reckless pilot who'd caused the deaths of 3 people, including his own child's mother. The cover-up had been orchestrated by Victoria's father, CEO Richard Sterling, and his executive team. They'd bought silence with money and destroyed careers with lawsuits. Daniel's wrongful termination suit had been settled for an undisclosed amount with a confidentiality agreement that banned him from ever speaking about the incident. Victoria found herself staring at a photo from the investigative file. Daniel at the congressional hearing, 28 years old and devastated, trying to tell the truth. While Sterling Dynamics lawyers systematically destroyed his credibility, he'd aged 20 years in the past decade. The confident test pilot had become a haunted mechanic, raising his daughter alone on the settlement money that was supposed to buy his silence about his girlfriend's death. Victoria's hands shook as she reached for her phone. Patricia? I need you to find out everything you can about Daniel's current situation. Financial, legal, personal, and… Patricia? Be discreet. Very discreet. Understood? Anything else? Victoria looked out at the gray Seattle afternoon, her reflection pale in the window glass. Yes, I need you to prepare a complete dossier on the Valkyrie incident. Every detail, every cover-up, every lie my father's administration told. I want the truth, even if it destroys me. The next morning brought another call from Patricia, this one heavy with sympathy. Miss, a bedban of heaven, G. Payton Sin, a Tet Heaven 42 Dr. Sterling. I've got Daniel Rivera's current financial picture. It's not good. Victoria braced herself. How not good? He's drowning. The settlement money ran out years ago. Medical bills from Emma's birth complications, Sarah's funeral expenses, legal fees. He makes $32,000 a year as a mechanic. But Emma has a chronic medical condition that requires expensive treatments. He's 3 months behind on rent, maxed out on credit cards, and his daughter doesn't know how bad things are. What kind of medical condition? Respiratory issues stemming from premature birth. She needs specialized inhalers, regular monitoring, the kind of care that costs $1,500 a month, even with insurance. Victoria's throat tightened. Sarah Chen had died giving birth to Daniel's daughter. And now, that daughter was suffering because her father had been robbed of his career. There's more, Patricia continued. Emma's teachers describe her as brilliant advanced mathematics, science, already talking about following in her parents' footsteps in aerospace. But Daniel's been telling her for years that college isn't realistic. He's trying to manage her expectations because he can't afford to give her the future she deserves. Victoria hung up and sat in her empty office. 40 floors above the city she'd conquered. She had everything: billions in assets, global respect, the power to reshape entire industries with a phone call. Daniel Rivera had nothing except a 12-year-old daughter who didn't know that her father had once been one of the best pilots in the world. And Victoria finally understood why he'd looked so haunted when he'd saved her life. It wasn't just the crash, wasn't just the pressure of the emergency landing. It was the bitter irony of saving the life of someone whose family had destroyed his. The drive to Pine Valley took 4 hours through winding mountain highways. Victoria made it in 3, her Tesla eating up the miles as her mind raced through everything she'd learned. She found Daniel exactly where she'd expected, in the garage bay at Pine Valley Regional, hands deep in the engine compartment of a Cessna 172. He looked up when her shadow fell across his workspace, his expression shifting from surprise to resignation. "Miss Sterling, I was wondering when you'd show up. You knew I'd investigate." Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, his movements slow and careful. "People like you always investigate. That's how you got where you are." Victoria stepped closer, noting the tired lines around his eyes, the careful way he held himself like someone expecting another blow. "I know who you are, Daniel. I know what happened." His jaw tightened. "Do you?" "Captain Daniel Rivera. Call sign, Ghost. Test pilot for Sterling Dynamics until the Valkyrie incident." She paused, watching his face. "I know about Sarah, about Emma, about the cover-up." Daniel's hands stilled. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hum of aircraft engines from the runway. "So what now?" he asked quietly. "You here to make sure I keep my mouth shut?" "The confidentiality agreement still holds. I can't talk about what happened, not even to defend myself. I'm not here to silence you." Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm here to apologize." Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "Apologize? My father destroyed your career to protect a $12 billion contract. He buried the truth about the engine defects. He let you take the blame for Sarah's death when he knew we all knew that you and she had tried to prevent exactly what happened." Victoria's composure cracked, 10 years of buried guilt rising to the surface. "You were right about the stress fractures. Sarah was right about the metallurgical analysis. You both tried to stop the test flight, and we ignored you because money mattered more than lives." Daniel stared at her, his carefully maintained distance wavering. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because when you saved my life 3 days ago, you gave me something I didn't deserve, and I've spent the last decade building an empire on the foundation of your destruction." Victoria's voice broke. I can't give Sarah back to you. I can't undo what my family did, but I can try to make it right. How? The word came out harsh, bitter with 10 years of buried rage. How do you make it right? Sarah's dead. Emma thinks her father is a failure. I haven't flown a real aircraft in a decade because your family made sure I'd never work in aviation again. Victoria reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. By telling the truth, by admitting what we did, by making sure everyone knows that Captain Daniel Rivera was a hero who tried to prevent a tragedy, not the reckless pilot who caused it. Daniel's hands shook as he took the folder. Inside were copies of every document Patricia had found: the engineering reports, the ignored warnings, the covered-up evidence, the sealed depositions that proved Sterling Dynamics' culpability. I'm going public with everything, Victoria said. The board will fight me. The legal department will have a heart attack. It might destroy the company, but it's the right thing to do. Daniel flipped through the pages. His own words from 10 years ago. His desperate attempts to warn anyone who would listen. Sarah's detailed reports on the engine defects. The truth they'd both tried so hard to tell. Why? He whispered. Why would you sacrifice everything for this? Victoria looked at him. This broken man, who'd given up his dreams to protect his daughter, who'd saved her life despite every reason to let her die. Because I finally met someone who reminded me what integrity looks like. Someone who chose to save a life, even when that life belonged to the people who'd destroyed his. She paused, watching understanding dawn in Daniel's eyes. You could have let me die in that cockpit. You could have walked away and called it justice. But you didn't. You saved me anyway. And now I understand what Sarah saw in you. What made her willing to build a life with someone who puts honor above everything else. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. He'd been holding back for 10 years. She believed in me. Right up. Until the end, she believed I was doing the right thing. And it's time the world knew it. For the first time in a decade, Daniel Rivera allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, the truth was stronger than the lies that had buried his life. And Victoria Sterling, looking at the man who'd taught her the meaning of courage, finally understood what her father's empire had cost and what she was willing to sacrifice to make it right. The Sterling Dynamics boardroom had never been quieter. 23 executives sat around the polished conference table, their faces ranging from shocked to horrified, as Victoria finished reading the prepared statement that would destroy everything they'd built. In conclusion, Victoria's voice was steady, despite the tremor in her hands. Sterling Dynamics takes full responsibility for the cover-up of safety defects that led to the Valkyrie incident of 2015. We formally apologize to Captain Daniel Rivera, whose warnings were ignored, and to the families of Dr. Sarah Chen and the other victims whose deaths could have been prevented. The silence stretched like a held breath. Then chaos erupted. "This is corporate suicide!" shouted CFO Michael Harrison, slamming his tablet on the table. "You're destroying a $50 billion company over something that happened 10 years ago." "The legal ramifications alone," began General Counsel Patricia Wells, "will be massive." Victoria finished calmly. "Wrongful death suits, regulatory fines, criminal investigations. I estimate we're looking at $20 billion in damages, minimum." Board Chairman Robert Pike, her father's oldest friend, stood slowly. His face was pale with fury. "Victoria, I'm calling an emergency vote. You're clearly not mentally competent to—" "Sit down, Robert." The steel in Victoria's voice cut through the room like a blade. She'd found something in the past 3 days that she'd never known she possessed the courage to choose what was, right over what was profitable. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm informing you of a decision that's already been made. The press conference is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Vice President of Operations, James Crawford, leaned forward. The Pentagon will cancel every military contract. The commercial aviation sector will blacklist us. You're talking about the complete destruction of Sterling Dynamics. No, Victoria said quietly. I'm talking about the rebirth of a company that remembers what integrity means. She looked around the table at faces that had grown fat on profits, built on covered-up deaths. My father built this empire on lies. I'm choosing to rebuild it on truth. The vote of no confidence passed 18-5. By evening, Victoria Sterling was no longer CEO of the company that bore her name. 2 states away, Daniel Rivera sat in his daughter's hospital room, watching Emma sleep under the soft glow of monitoring equipment. Her latest asthma attack had been severe, enough to require emergency treatment, and the bills were piling up like snow in an avalanche. Mr. Rivera? A nurse appeared in the doorway. There's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent. Daniel looked up to find Victoria standing in the hospital corridor, her business suit replaced by jeans and a simple sweater. Her eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. But there was something different about her, a lightness that hadn't been there before. How did you know we were here? Daniel asked quietly, not wanting to wake Emma. Rita at the airport called me. Said you'd asked for time off because Emma was sick. Victoria's voice was gentle. I wanted to make sure you knew I did it. I told the truth. Daniel stared at her. The whole truth? Everything. The cover-up. The ignored warnings. The way we destroyed your career to protect our profits. Victoria's voice cracked. It'll be on every news channel tomorrow morning. And your company? Gone. The board fired me 6 hours ago. Sterling Dynamics will probably file for bankruptcy within a year. She managed a small smile. Turns out the truth is expensive. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, processing what she'd given up, what she'd sacrificed, for the chance to clear his name. Victoria, you didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. She looked through the doorway at Emma, the 12-year-old girl whose brilliant mind was trapped in a failing body, whose father worked 16-hour days to pay for treatments that barely kept her breathing. My father took everything from you. Your career, your reputation, your future, Sarah's life. I couldn't give those things back. But I could give you justice. What will you do now? Victoria laughed, a sound without bitterness. I have no idea. For the first time in 40 years, I don't have a 5-year plan. She paused. But I do have a proposal. Daniel raised an eyebrow. I'm starting a new company, Sterling Safety Solutions. Independent aviation consulting focused on preventing accidents instead of covering them up. Victoria's eyes brightened. I need a chief pilot, someone who understands that lives matter more than profits. Victoria. Emma's medical bills would be covered by company insurance, full benefits, stock options, and a salary that would let you both live without worrying about money. She hesitated. And flight time. As much as you want. Commercial, military contract work. Test flights for companies that actually listen to their pilots. Daniel felt tears threatening. After 10 years of exile, the chance to fly again, really fly. Not just dream about it in a maintenance hangar. There's one condition, Victoria added softly. I need you to testify at the congressional hearings. Tell your side of the story. Help me make sure this never happens to another pilot. Another family. Daniel looked at his daughter, sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, thanks to medications he could barely afford. Emma, who dreamed of Emma, following in her parents' footsteps, but had been told to lower her expectations because college was too expensive. When do we start? The congressional hearing room was packed 3 weeks later. Camera crews lined the walls, while reporters filled every available seat. Daniel sat at the witness table in a navy suit, that Victoria had insisted on buying, his hands steady for the first time in a decade. "Captain Rivera," the committee chairman began, "please tell us in your own words what happened on the day of the Valkyrie incident." Daniel leaned into the microphone, his voice clear and strong. "I tried to save 3 lives, including my girlfriend's and my unborn daughter's. Sterling Dynamics made sure I failed. For 2 hours, he told the story that had been buried for 10 years, the engineering reports that were ignored, the safety meetings where concerns were dismissed, the pressure to push an experimental aircraft beyond its design limits to meet an arbitrary deadline. He spoke about Sarah Chen, the brilliant engineer who'd loved him enough to fight for their future together, about Emma, born in the aftermath of tragedy, growing up believing her father was a failure instead of a hero. When he finished, the hearing room was silent. "Captain Rivera," the ranking committee member said slowly, "are you saying that Sterling Dynamics knowingly flew an aircraft with defective engines? I'm saying they chose profit over people. And when the consequences killed 3 innocent victims, they chose to destroy my reputation rather than accept responsibility." The headline dominated news cycles for a week. "Hero pilot cleared. Decade-long cover-up exposed." Emma cried when she read the articles about her father online, not from sadness, but from pride. Her dad wasn't a failed mechanic after all. He was Captain Ghost Rivera, one of the best test pilots who'd ever lived. "Dad," she said that evening as they packed their belongings for the move to Seattle, "can you teach me to fly?" Daniel smiled, wrapping his daughter in a hug that felt like coming home. "Sweetheart, I can teach you to soar." 6 months later, Victoria stood on the tarmac at Boeing Field, watching Daniel run through pre-flight checks on Sterling Safety Solutions' first aircraft, a modified Gulfstream, equipped with the most advanced safety systems money could buy. The company was small, but growing. 3 pilots, 2 engineers, and a revolutionary approach to aviation safety that put human life ahead of everything else. The Pentagon had already awarded them 2 consulting contracts, and commercial airlines were lining up for their services. "You ready for this?" Victoria called out as Daniel finished his inspection. "More ready than I've been in 10 years, he replied, climbing into the pilot's seat with an ease that spoke of coming home. Victoria took the co-pilot's position, still amazed by the transformation in both their lives. She'd lost an empire, but found something more valuable, the peace that came from sleeping well at night. Daniel's hands moved across the controls with practiced precision. The same hands that had saved her life twice, now once in a crashing jet, and once by showing her what integrity looked like. "Wherever we're needed," he said, advancing the throttles. "Wherever someone needs to know that the truth is worth fighting for." The Gulfstream lifted off into the Seattle morning, climbing toward a sky that suddenly seemed full of possibilities. In the cabin behind them, Emma sat with her laptop, working on a college application essay about aerospace engineering and the father who'd taught her that heroes weren't perfect. They were just people who chose to do the right thing, even when it cost them everything. The title of her essay was simple: Learning to Fly. As they climbed through 10,000 feet, Victoria looked over at Daniel. This man who'd lost everything and somehow found the strength to save the Prazenzinareda, life of his destroyer. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Saving me, instead of letting justice take its course?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the horizon ahead. "Sarah used to say that the best revenge is a life well lived. Not because it hurts your enemies, but because it proves they couldn't break you." He glanced at Victoria, this woman who'd given up billions to give him back his dignity. Besides, sometimes saving someone else is how you save yourself. Below them, the world stretched out in all directions, full of flights to take, lives to save, and truths still waiting to be told. They flew together into that endless sky. Two people who'd learned that redemption wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about having the courage to build a better future from the wreckage of yesterday's mistakes. Emma looked up from her laptop as the aircraft leveled off, sunlight streaming through the windows. For the first time in her 12 years, she wasn't worried about her father's next paycheck or her mother's empty chair at the dinner table. She was thinking about the wings she would design someday. Aircraft that would never crash, because people like her father and Victoria would make sure the truth came first. Always. The little girl born from tragedy had grown into someone who understood that the most important flight wasn't the one that took you away from your problems. It was the one that carried you home to yourself. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.